Afghanistan, a war which cost the lives of nearly 15,000 young Soviet conscripts and an estimated 1 million Afghans.
Well, the Afghan war started because there was a revolution in Afghanistan and the king was kicked out. And so there was a problem between the people that kicked out the war. I mean, the king. And they were students. Much of this was done by students. But the students then divided between religious ones and the others non-religious ones. And there were a lot of other reasons, of course, but the revolution against the king and the departure of the king was the beginning of many of the problems that would happen later in Afghanistan. Okay.
The Afghan War. Well, it started in 1979. It has to do with the invasion of communism of the countries in the Middle East, and how some people inside the country did not agree with that kind of government, and because they felt that the religion that they share, which is Islam, was not being respected by the Soviet government, and they formed a guerrilla to rebel against it.
It all started in the late December 1979 by the troops from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union intervened in support of the Afghan Communist government in its conflict with the anti-communist Muslim guerrillas during the Afghan War, and remained in Afghanistan until mid-February 1989.
Here, this was part of the problem with the divisions in Afghanistan between Islamists, meaning people who are of the religious, they wanted to build an Islamic state in Afghanistan, and students and the president at the time were against that. And so they were attacked by the religious part, and the president of Afghanistan asked for the Soviet Union to come in and help. Of course, the Soviets also wanted to get into Afghanistan for a very important reason. They did not want the United States to go in there. Okay? And one of the most attractive things that Afghanistan has is gas. No petróleo, sino gas. Okay.
In April 1978, Afghanistan's centrist government, headed by President Mohammad Khan, was overthrown by left-wing military officers led by Nur Muhammad Taraki. Power was thereafter shared by two Marxist-Leninist political groups, the People's Party and the Baath Party.
What was the aim of the Soviet operation? Well, the original aim, or one of the aims, there were many aims, but one of them was to help the president so that there is no Islamic State established in Afghanistan. But as I mentioned, they also wanted to, it was a strategic place. Afghanistan is between Pakistan and India and Iran on one side, So it was always a strategic region. And this is for thousands of years. It has been a strategic situation. The fact is that the Soviets were, in the war, did not have much success. So they were, instead of going in like with one quick operation to help the president and etc., it became a long war. The Mujahideen, the Islamic side, was already getting weapons from the United States, interestingly enough, and from Saudi Arabia.
Backed by the United States, the Mujahideen rebellion grew, spreading to all parts of the country. The Afghan war quickly settled down into a stalemate with more than 100,000 Soviet troops, controlling the cities, larger towns, and major garrisons, and the Mujahideen movement with relative freedom throughout the countryside.
The Mujahideen group was born mainly by people who escaped the cities where the communist changes were happening. So they went to the mountains, okay? And they went there because they didn't agree with the things that were happening. So they sort of started a movement. And part of what they wanted was like recover that identity of being Muslim, which they believed that the communists were erasing in a way. So what they did was that they created this guerrilla movement in the mountains that had this very strong religious component. And they thought of themselves as soldiers of God who were going to recover the Afghan government.
These uprisings, along with the internal fighting and coups, prompted the Soviets to invade the country on the night of December 24, 1979, sending in some 30,000 troops and toppling the short-lived presidency of People's Leader Hafizullah Amin.
The Soviets found themselves now having to fight guerrilla warfare from Islamist groups that were coming from outside. Since the Russians wanted to prevent the Islamic side take control of Afghanistan, many Islamic countries like Saudi Arabia, especially Saudi Arabia, and the United States through Saudi Arabia, started to send guerrillas over there, people who were not even from Afghanistan. What was the purpose of the Pakistanis in Afghanistan? Well, they were playing politics between the United States, Afghanistan, and India, and they also gave refuge for many of the Afghan refugees in there. The role was, very mixed up, but the whole region is very strategic.
The Soviets attempt to eliminate the Mujahideen civilian support by bombing and depopulating the rural areas. By 1982, some 2.8 million Afghans had sought asylum in Pakistan, and another 1.5 million had fled to Iran.
Who were the Taliban? Okay, the Taliban were the original opposition to the king and then to a non-religious state. Taliban in Afghan comes from an Arabic word that means students, and that's what they were originally.
Why do you think Mikhail Gorbachev was fired?
Well, I wouldn't say he was actually fired, but more than he lost his power. Okay, Gorbachev came at the end of what we now know as the end of the Soviet Union. Okay, and he was a reformist. He didn't exactly agree with everything that was going on in the Soviet Union. He was trying to make some changes. For him, the changes were to maintain the power of the Soviet Union. The thing is that his changes were too radical for some people, and some people believed that Gorbachev was making the Soviet Union look weak. And they didn't want that, okay? So for them, Gorbachev was guilty of making the Soviet Union look bad in the eyes of the world. So the conservative section of his government pretty much kidnapped him for a while And it was the governors and the presidents of the other republics that were not from the Soviet Union that got together and sort of rescued him. But once you have to get rescued, you don't have credibility anymore to lead the country. So he had to be removed from power. So I think it has to do with Gorbachev wanting to be part of a modern world that the rest of the Soviet Union was not ready for, and that's why he doesn't work for them, and he eventually is ousted of power.
What do you think the US wanted to do with Afghanistan?
I'm not exactly sure, but I do believe that for the United States, it was mostly a thing of competition with the Soviet Union. It was about winning. It was not about helping the country exactly. It was about getting there or being more successful than the Soviets. Okay, it was for them. It was defeating communism and doing whatever you have to do to defeat communism, because in doing that, they sort of opened the way for something like the Taliban's to work, and that ended up literally blowing in their own faces.
An interesting thing that maybe would be interesting for you to know is that Afghanistan has always been, I'm going to say it in Spanish, una tumba para los invasores. Since Alexander the Great, you know that name, Alejandro Magno, until now, anybody who tried to invade Afghanistan was defeated. Nobody succeeded, and history does not learn the lesson. So you had Alejandro Magno, later somebody else, then came the British, then came the Russians, now the Americans, and all of them fall into the same trap. They cannot control it. The Afghan people, it's the geography of the country, which is all mountains and everything like that. So it's easy to have guerrilla wars there. It's not flat. It took a long time, but in the end, el invasor pierde. Nunca ha ganado. Nadie ha podido conquistar y guardar control de Afganistán.
Despite having failed to implement a sympathetic regime in Afghanistan, in 1988 the Soviet Union signed an accord with the United States, Pakistan and Afghanistan and agreed to withdraw its troops.
It's very sad to see all these lives this war has taken, not only from soldiers but from innocent children, men and women.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. Dwight D. Eisenhower. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word. Martin Luther King Jr.
Mankind must put an end to the war before war puts an end to mankind. John F. Kennedy. Think about it.